Cold gets into your bones differently when you're alone. That was the thing nobody told you about the Canadian wilderness. Not the bears, not the isolation, not the endless grey of a November sky pressing down like a lid on a jar. It was the cold, the kind that settled deep into your marrow and reminded you, at 3 in the morning, that nobody knew your name out here. Wren had learned that in her first winter at the claim. She learned it again the afternoon the two men rode up the logging road. She was splitting birch rounds when she heard the truck, an old half-ton rust-eaten along the wheel wells, moving slow the way trucks move when they already know nobody's expecting them. The engine cut 60 yards from the woodpile. She kept the axe in her hand. She didn't set it down. There were two of them. The one who stepped out first was lean, weathered, somewhere in his late 40s, wearing a canvas work jacket the color of old mustard. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once, before something mean had taken up permanent residence behind the eyes. The second one was younger, thicker through the chest. He wore a knitted cap, pulled low over a broad forehead, and he didn't quite look at her directly. Afternoon, the first man said. His name was Harker. She would find that out later. She didn't answer. She kept the axe loose in her grip. Harker smiled with his teeth. Looks like you're working hard out here. Woman alone, all this land. Your uncle's land, isn't it? Was. The emphasis on that last word was deliberate. Wren's uncle, Douglas, had died 4 months earlier. He'd left the 47 acres to her in a handwritten will that the county had registered without contest. There was nothing complicated about the title. She had checked twice. He left it to you. Harker continued, stepping forward. But a woman out here by herself, all this timber, all this creek frontage, seems like a waste, don't it? We represent some people who'd make a fair offer. Generous even, better than what you'd clear trying to run this place alone. His eyes moved over the woodpile, the cabin, the lean-to, where she kept the chainsaw, and the come-along and the diesel cans, settling on her in a way that made her skin tighten. I'm not selling, Wren said. Harker looked at the younger man. The younger man stopped watching the ground and started watching her instead. You might want to reconsider, Harker said. Lots of things happen to property out here. Accidents, fires, water lines freeze and burst, and nobody notices until spring. She tightened her grip on the axe handle. The younger man moved first. He covered the distance between them faster than she expected, his arms swinging wide. She stepped into it, instead of back, the way her uncle had taught her when she was 12 years old, and the blow caught her across the cheekbone instead of the jaw. The world went sideways. Her knees hit the frozen ground. She still had the axe. She swung it into the back of his knee. Not the blade, the handle, and he buckled with a grunt that sounded more like surprise than pain. Harker grabbed her from behind. His forearm came across her throat. She clawed at his jacket, got a fist into his ribs, felt something shift, but not enough. Her vision was narrowing at the edges. She was going to lose consciousness in the next 30 seconds, and she knew it the way you know the tide coming in. Certain, inevitable, nothing to argue with. Then the porch boards groaned. She didn't hear footsteps on the road. She hadn't heard a vehicle, hadn't heard anything over the blood rushing in her ears and the creak of frozen birch in the wind. But something filled the doorway of her uncle's cabin, and when Harker's grip slackened slightly and she turned her head, she understood why. He stood in the doorway, with his arms at his sides. That was the thing she would think about later, lying awake with ice on her face. That he didn't have a weapon drawn, didn't have his hands raised, didn't announce himself. He just stood there, and the sheer fact of him seemed to change the temperature of the afternoon. He was enormous, not in the inflated way of men who lift weights in gyms, in the way of men who have moved through hard country for a long time, and the country has shaped them accordingly. His jacket was dark canvas and heavy wool, worn at the elbows. His jaw was covered in a month's worth of dark beard going grey at the corners. His eyes were the colour of creekter in late October, a particular shade of cold grey-green that didn't leave you once you'd seen it. He looked at Harker. He looked at the younger man on the ground. He looked at Wren with her hair in her face and the axe still in her fist. "Let her go," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the strangest part. He didn't raise it. He said it the way you'd say it's going to rain. A simple observation about the state of things. Harker didn't let go immediately. He was the kind of man who needed a moment to decide whether his pride could afford to. The man in the doorway stepped off the porch. Harker let go. What followed was not a fight in any cinematic sense. It was brief and functional, and it ended with the younger man holding his dislocated shoulder against his chest and Harker on his knees in the frozen gravel with face in his hands. The man who had stepped off the porch hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't lost his footing. He walked back toward the cabin with the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with, and he stopped in front of Wren. "Your cheek is bleeding," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her hand. "Still on the axe. You can put it down." She didn't. He seemed to understand that. He nodded once, not in concession, more like he was filing the information away, and walked back to the porch without another word. His name was Conrad. She got that out of him 2 hours later when he was sitting at her uncle's kitchen table, drinking black coffee that she had not offered, and that he had made himself from the can on the shelf, because he'd simply seen where she kept it. He'd wrapped a strip of clean cloth around his right hand. He'd split the knuckle on the younger man's skull, and he did it efficiently, one-handed, the way of someone who had bandaged his own injuries many times before, in places where no one else was available to help. "Conrad," she repeated. "Just that?" He looked at the coffee cup. "Just that? Where'd you come from?" He tilted his head slightly north toward the ridge, had a camp up off the McKittrick cut line. "Been up there since July. That's 7 months. He didn't disagree. She sat down across from him. Her cheek was swollen, and she could feel her heartbeat in it. She had pressed a cloth to the cut and held it there until the bleeding slowed, and she was still holding it, because releasing it would mean admitting. The bleeding had stopped, and she didn't want to appear to be managing herself in front of him. He noticed anyway. He always noticed. "You should use something cold," he said. "Swelling will be bad by tomorrow. I've had worse." He looked at her. The grey-green eyes moved over her face with the calm assessment of someone reading a weather map. He wasn't impressed by her stoicism. He wasn't dismissing it either. He was simply noting it. "I know," he said. The words landed strangely, not as consolation, as plain acknowledgement. She wanted to ask him why he'd come down off the ridge, why he'd walked up to a stranger's cabin, why he was sitting in her uncle's kitchen drinking her coffee, instead of continuing north wherever he'd been headed. But asking those questions felt like conceding something she wasn't ready to concede. So instead she said, "They'll be back." He nodded. "Probably. With more people. Likely." She looked at the window. The light was going fast, the way it did in November, 4 o'clock and nearly dark. The pines on the east ridge swallowed up in grey. Harker's truck was gone. She'd heard it pull away 40 minutes ago. "You don't have to stay," she said. "No," he agreed. He didn't leave. She woke twice in the night, once at 11, when the wind changed direction and hit the north wall with a new sharpness that rattled the old storm window in its frame. The second time at 3, from a dream she couldn't hold on to. Only the feeling of it, something falling, and the certainty that no one would catch it. Both times, through the gap in the bedroom door, she could see the orange glow of the wood stove. She could hear the occasional shift and settle of weight in the old armchair by the fire. She did not go out. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the stove, and the wind, and the rhythmic, barely audible creak of him breathing in the chair, and slowly, against every instinct she'd spent 3 years sharpening in this place, she fell back asleep. Morning came iron grey and still. She found a full wood box and fresh water in the kitchen, Siston and Conrad already outside by first light, studying the logging road with his coffee cup in his hand like a man reading a newspaper. She stood on the porch in her wool jacket and watched him. He had found her uncle's old axe and rehung the head. Douglas had let the wedge work loose over the past year, and she hadn't had time to fix it. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing you had to know to notice. "Ribs okay?" he asked, without turning around. She'd been favoring her left side where Harker's arm had wrenched her. She hadn't said anything about it. "Bruised," she answered, "not cracked. Breathe deep." She did, and the hitch in her chest was small but real. "Might be one," he said. "Don't let it go. If it shifts wrong, you'll know." She went inside and made breakfast. He came in when the smell of the pan hit the air, and he ate. Without ceremony, quickly and without waste. And he did the dishes after without being asked because the dishes needed doing, and he was standing there. She watched him at the basin and thought about the kind of men she'd known who did the dishes. There weren't many. Douglas had. Her father never had. The man she'd been engaged to, briefly, in her late 20s, had arranged to be elsewhere whenever the dishes appeared, she thought. This is a strange thing to be thinking about. She thought it anyway. In the afternoon, she drove to the highway, 16 kilometers on frozen gravel, to call her uncle's lawyer from the payphone at the gas station because her cell signal at the claim was non-existent. The lawyer confirmed what she already knew. The title was clean. Harker's employers. He named a forestry speculation company she'd heard of, but never had dealings with, had no legal avenue. What they had, the lawyer said carefully, was a pattern of informal persuasion in several similar situations across the Northern Territories, meaning they send men to scare people off, Wren said. The line was quiet for a moment. "That is one interpretation," he said. She drove back in the failing light. Conrad was on the roof of the lean-to when she got there, replacing 2 rotten boards on the east face that she'd been meaning to get to since September. She stood in the yard and looked up at him. "You could have told me you were doing that," she said. "You weren't here," he replied. She could have argued the logic of that. She didn't. He came down, off the roof of the daylight, rolling down his sleeves. There was sawdust in his hair, and he didn't seem to notice it. He looked at her face when she came up to the porch. A quick scan, checking something, and whatever he was checking for must have been absent, because he stepped back and let her pass inside. It went like that for 2 weeks. He slept in the armchair. She offered the spare room on the 5th day, and he looked at it and said the chair was fine. She stopped arguing. He was up before she was every morning. And the woodbox was always full, and the problem with the water pressure on the North Line that she'd been puzzling over since October was solved on day 9 without her having to mention it, because he'd apparently noticed it the first time he drew water. He didn't talk much. What he said was direct and factual, and often useful. "The drainage off the south slope is cutting wrong," he told her one evening. "Going to take out the base of the access road in 2 springs. Maybe 3. Needs a diversion swale cut across here." He drew it on the back of an envelope, a simple line with an arrow, "before freeze-up next year." She looked at the drawing. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "That," he shrugged. "Same thing happened to a site I had up past the Wilmore boundary. Lost the whole access in one melt." He folded the envelope and put it on the table beside her. "Did it twice before I understood what I was looking at." He said it without bitterness, without self-pity. He talked about his time in the north the way you'd talk about weather patterns. It had been a factor. He had observed it. He had adjusted accordingly. She asked him, on the 10th night, what had brought him south. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The fire had burned down low, and she hadn't added wood because she'd wanted to see whether he would. He had, at the last moment before it would have gone cold. "I had a camp partner for a while," he said finally. "We ran lines up past the Cardinal Divide. 3 seasons." He was quiet, in the useful way. "You know the kind. Didn't fill the air just to be filling it." She knew the kind. She thought of Douglas. "He went south," Conrad said. "Had a daughter having a baby. Just needed to go." He looked at his hands. "I stayed through the winter alone. Got a bad cold in January. Not serious, nothing you'd go to a doctor for. But there were 2-3 days where I wasn't quite right. Fever, he paused, and I realized that if it had gone a different way, if it had been worse, no one would have known for months. He said it flatly, without drama. That's a thing you know abstractly, living that way, and then one day you feel it as a fact. Wren looked at the fire. He came south when the spring broke, he told her, not for any particular destination, just south. He'd been making his way down the logging roads through the summer when he'd come across her uncle's property, and he'd made a camp on the ridge to wait out a stretch of bad weather. And he'd been there when she arrived in July to take possession of the claim. He'd watched her from the ridge for a week before he'd come down. Why? She asked. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You were doing it wrong, he said. Not incompetently, just too fast, too much, burning yourself out trying to prove the place was manageable. He looked at her. It isn't manageable, not in the way you were trying. It needs to be worked with, not against. She thought she should be offended by that. She wasn't. Because he was right, and she knew it, and there was something almost physically relieving about having someone say it plainly, instead of letting her exhaust herself against the truth of it. I didn't need rescuing, she said. He looked at her with the grey-green eyes that gave nothing away and everything away, simultaneously. I know, he said. You had the axe. You were still standing in the doorway. You had already put him on the ground, he said. I just changed the calculation. She looked away. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was picking up off the eastern ridge, that long, low moan through the spruce that she had started to know, as well as any sound she'd ever known. Why did you tell me that? She asked. The Wilmore camp story. The fever. You don't tell people things like that. He was quiet for a moment. Because you asked why I came down off the ridge, he said, and that was the actual reason. She didn't say anything. The fire settled. In the window, the first snow of the season was beginning to come down, soft and serious, the kind that meant business. Conrad pulled the blanket off the back of the armchair and settled it over his shoulders. His eyes went to the window, watching the snow. She watched him watching it. She thought, I have not slept through the night since I came to this place. She thought, I have slept through the last 12 nights. She didn't say either of those things, but she thought them. And they sat in the room alongside the fire, and the sound of the snow against the glass, and they felt like something she would return to. Harker came back on a Thursday. She knew he was coming 2 days before, not from any particular sign, nothing so clean as crowspook or hoof sound. She simply woke at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday with absolute certainty that he was on his way, and she lay in the dark and felt the shape of it. She told Conrad at breakfast. He nodded once. He didn't ask how she knew. He got up and walked outside with his coffee and stood at the edge of the yard for a long time, looking at the road. That evening, he showed her where he'd repositioned the gear shed, so its angle created a sight line to the main approach. He showed her the gap in the east tree line where any vehicle on the logging road could be seen for 30 seconds before it reached the yard. Keep the rifle in the house, not the lean-to, he said. The shotgun is for close. The rifle is for when you need time to think. I know how to use a rifle. I know, he said. I'm not telling you how. I'm telling you where. There was a difference. She understood it. He went over the snowshoe trail up the ridge. He showed her where it cut through, where it crossed the creek, where you could come down the back face if the road was blocked. Not because he expected her to run, but because knowing you had a way out changed how you stood your ground. She saw that distinction too. Harker arrived on Thursday at 11 in the morning in a different truck. There were 4 men with him. She recognized him from the passenger seat when the truck was still at the tree line gap, 30 seconds, out exactly where Conrad had said. She had the rifle in her hands. Conrad was in the lean-to. He'd been there all morning, working on the chainsaw carb, and he stayed there when the truck came in, doing nothing, not moving toward the yard. She understood. They needed to see her first. They needed to believe they were dealing with a woman alone. Harker got out of the truck. He looked older and worse than he had 3 weeks ago. His nose was crooked in a new way. He looked at her on the porch with the rifle, and his face went through several expressions before it settled on contemptuous. "You going to shoot me, are you?" He walked forward. The 4 men behind him fanned out the way men do when they've done this before. "I don't think you are. I think you're a woman who inherited a piece of land she doesn't know what to do with, and now she's standing on a porch with a gun. She doesn't want to fire." He was calculating the rifle as theater. She sighted down the barrel. She put the bead on the upright post of the old birch snag at the far edge of the yard, 30 meters left of Harker, and she squeezed the trigger. The shot was flat and hard in the cold air. The top of the snag exploded in a shower of white wood. Harker stopped. She levered the next round in. "The sound of it carried," she said. "That was not a warning shot. That was me telling you what I can do from here." Harker's face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not fear exactly, recalculation. One of the men behind him was already looking at the lean-to. He'd heard it before she had. The sound of the chainsaw carb being set down on the workbench, the particular silence that follows when someone stops working and starts listening instead. Conrad came out of the lean-to without hurrying. He didn't have a firearm. He had her uncle's old splitting maul over one shoulder, balanced there as casually as a man carrying a broom. He walked out into the yard and stopped beside the woodpile, maybe 15 meters from the nearest of Harker's men. He looked at Harker. He didn't look at the 4 men. "Last time I said leave," he said. "I was being polite." He set the maul head down on the frozen ground, both hands on the handle. He wasn't threatening. He was simply there. His size, his stillness, the particular quality of his attention. It changed the air in the yard the way weather changed it. You could feel the pressure dropping. Harker looked at the rifle. He looked at Conrad. He looked at the 4 men he'd brought, who were no longer in the comfortable posture of men conducting routine intimidation. One of them took a step backward, just one step. But it was the step that broke the formation. Harker's jaw moved. He wanted to say something. She could see it. The need to have the last word, to leave with something intact. He was the kind of man who had built himself entirely on other people's capitulation, and without it, he was standing in a cold yard in November with nothing. He looked at her on the porch one last time. She didn't lower the rifle. Harker turned around. He got in the truck. The 4 men got in after him, with the particular studied nonchalance of people, trying not to look like they were retreating, and the truck turned around in the yard and went back up the logging road and was gone. The crow in the birch snag, startled by the shot, had come back and was sitting at the jagged end of the branch she'd destroyed, cocking its head at the yard below. Conrad set the maul against the woodpile. He looked at her on the porch. She looked at him. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She had expected the shaking to come, the way it had after the first time. The crash of adrenaline leaving, the cold flood of the aftermath. But her hands were steady, and the rifle was steady, and she was standing on the porch of her uncle's land in the November cold, and she was still there. She stepped down from the porch. She walked across the yard toward him. He turned to face her, and for a moment she simply looked at his face, the broken nose, the grey, scared jawline, the eyes that held the particular expression of someone who had stood in enough cold yards to know when something was over. "You're bleeding," she said. His knuckle had opened again. She could see the dark line of it on his hand. "Woodbench corner," he said. "It's nothing. Come inside." He didn't move immediately. He looked at her in the particular way he had, like he was checking some internal gauge she didn't have access to. "Your hands are steady," he said. "Yes." He nodded. Like that was the thing he'd been waiting to confirm. She turned toward the porch. After a moment she heard his boots on the frozen ground behind her, following. Inside, she set the rifle against the wall and found the first aid tin on the shelf, where her uncle had always kept it. She sat him down at the kitchen table and cleaned the split knuckle with the frankness of someone who had bandaged their own injuries alone too many times to be delicate about other people's. He watched her work. "You should have stayed inside," he said. She looked up. She met his eyes. "I don't stay inside," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that. "No," he said, "you don't." She pressed a strip of cloth over the knuckle and tied it. His hands were large and heavy-scarred and cold from the yard, and she held the injured one a moment longer than strictly necessary, feeling the weight of it. "I know you came down off the ridge for yourself," she said. He was quiet. "I know it wasn't for me," she continued. "You said that. The fever, the silence. You came down because you needed to, not to rescue someone." He watched her. "But you came back," she said. "From the truck run into town. You came back with flour and oil and a new drive belt for the saw, and you didn't have to. And this morning, you put the rifle inside the door before I was awake." He said nothing. "You've been," she started and stopped. She didn't have the right word for what he'd been. Present wasn't right. It was more particular than that. He had been exactly what was needed, and nothing more and nothing less. The way a piece of land is what it is, regardless of whether you want it to be something else. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Do what?" She looked at their hands. His bandaged, hers, still holding it. "Trust someone to stay," she said. The fire settled in the stove. Through the window, the pines on the east ridge caught the afternoon light the way they did in November, going briefly gold before the cloud came over. Conrad looked at their hands, too. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not in the way of a promise sworn on feeling. In the way of a fact, established by evidence. I was up on that ridge for 7 months. I came down once for you, and I came back." "That is not enough data," she said. He almost smiled. "Almost." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at the window at the ridge. "I'll stay the winter," he said. "After that you can decide." She looked at him, at the grey-green eyes that she'd looked into for 2 weeks and still couldn't fully read, which was probably the thing she trusted most about them. "I don't burn the bread," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Douglas taught me," she said. "My uncle," he said. "Anyone who burns bread is just not paying attention, and inattention in this country will kill you eventually." Conrad turned his coffee cup in his scarred hands. "He was a practical man, your uncle. He was." The stove ticked. The light through the window was going. November pulling it down below the tree line the way it always did, fast and without ceremony. But inside the old cabin that Douglas had built, and that Wren had inherited and was learning to make her own, the fire held, and the cold stayed at the glass, and the long siege of a winter alone that she had been bracing for since July quietly became something else. She wasn't sure yet what to call it, but she felt the shape of it settling into the room like good heat, slow to build, sure to last.